The wind did not merely blow across the New Mexico territory, it scoured. It carried the taste of copper and ancient dust, stripping the paint from wood and hope from the soul. For Cora Bennett, huddling beside the wreckage of a wagon that had been her last lifeline. The wind felt like a judgment she could not outrun. It was late, the hour when the desert floor turned from baked gold to a bruising purple. Her wagon, a second-hand buckboard she had purchased 3 towns back with the last of her silver, lay on its side like a dead beast. The rear axle had snapped with a sound like a gunshot, sending her meager supplies tumbling into the sagebrush. Now, she sat in the dirt, her skirts torn at the hem and heavy with grit. Her lips were cracked, tasting of salt and despair. Beside her sat a small, battered trunk bound with leather straps. It contained everything she owned: 2 dresses, a Bible she no longer read, and a locket from a mother she could barely remember. Cora shivered, though the air was still holding the day's heat. She gripped the handle of a small paring knife hidden in the folds of her dress. She was 24 years old, and she had learned in the last 3 months that the world was not kind to women who traveled alone. A sound cut through the howling wind, the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She scrambled to her feet, backing against the upturned wagon. Out here, strangers were rarely saviors. They were bandits, or worse. She watched a flicker of light bobbing in the distance, growing larger, transforming into the erratic flame of a torch held aloft. The rider emerged from the swirling dust like a phantom born of the earth itself. The horse was a paint, strong and broad-chested, snorting against the grit. But it was the rider who froze the breath in Cora's throat. He was shirtless despite the stinging sand, his skin the color of polished bronze. Black paint streaked across his cheekbones, and his hair was braided long and thick. A Winchester rifle rested easily across his thighs. A Comanche, a warrior. Cora's hand tightened on the knife until her knuckles turned white. She had heard the stories whispered in the parlors back east, tales of savagery and blood. She braced herself, ready to die, but determined to make it difficult for him. The horse stopped 10 feet away. The warrior looked down at her. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone carved by the elements. He looked at the knife in her trembling hand, then at the broken wagon, and finally met her eyes. When he spoke, the sound was jarring, not a war cry, but a low, resonant baritone speaking perfect, unaccented English. "If you stay out here another hour, you will dry up and blow away with the tumbleweeds." He shifted slightly in his saddle, the leather creaking. "Do you wish to die tonight, Miss?" Cora blinked, the adrenaline turning to confusion. The calmness of his voice was more disarming than a weapon. He sounded rational. He sounded tired. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "I intend to survive, sir." "Then put away the knife," he said, extending a hand not to take, but to offer. "Your iron tooth will not stop the thirst." It was a choice between the terrifying unknown of the desert night or the terrifying unknown of the man on the horse. Cora looked at the endless dark stretching out around them, then at the warrior's steady hand. She sheathed the knife. He pulled her up behind him with surprising strength. She sat stiffly, careful not to touch his bare skin more than necessary, her hands hovering near his waist. He smelled of wood smoke, horsehair, and rain that hadn't fallen yet. "My trunk," she said breathlessly. "Leave it," he commanded, turning the horse. "If you live, you can come back for it. If you do not, you will not need it." He rode in silence, navigating the shifting dunes and rocky arroyos as if he carried a map of the land in his blood. He did not ask her name, and he offered none of his own. Just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet, they reached a ridge overlooking a cluster of buildings. Mesquite Crossing. It was a scar of civilization on the face of the wilderness, a collection of wooden structures huddled together against the vastness. The warrior stopped the horse a quarter of a mile from the town limits. "I'm no closer," he said. He slid down, helping her descend. His movements were fluid, economic. Cora smoothed her ruined dress, feeling the grit embedded in the fabric. "Thank you," she said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "You saved my life." He looked at her, his dark eyes assessing. "The town is there. Walking is good for the blood." He mounted his horse again without a backward glance, turning toward a hidden trail that led away from the town, toward the jagged hills to the west. Cora watched him go until he was swallowed by the landscape, a ghost returning to the shadows. She turned toward Mesquite Crossing. She walked with her head high, despite the fatigue trembling in her legs. She needed water, a job, and a place to sleep. She was Cora Bennett, and she had survived worse than a broken wagon. The town was waking up. The smell of stale beer and frying bacon hung in the air. A blacksmith's hammer rang out like a church bell, metallic and rhythmic. Men leaned against porch posts, watching her pass with eyes narrowed by suspicion and the morning sun. She made her way to the center of town, where a large board stood outside the sheriff's office, plastered with notices. She stopped, intending to ask for directions to a boarding house, but her own face stared back at her. It was a sketch, rough but recognizable, the arch of her brow, the stubborn line of her jaw. Wanted information, Cora Bennett, runaway bride, suspected of immoral conduct, traveling with actors, gamblers, and thieves. Reward for information leading to her return to the custody of Reverend Elijah Graves. The air left her lungs. Immoral conduct. The words felt like a physical slap. They had branded her. Elijah had branded her, reaching out across hundreds of miles to stain her name before she even arrived. "That looks a lot like you, doesn't it?" Cora spun around. A man with tobacco stains on his beard was grinning at her, pointing a calloused finger at the poster. "No," she whispered, backing away. "It's a mistake." She turned and hurried toward a diner across the street, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully. The scent of coffee was overwhelming, making her stomach cramp with hunger. She approached the counter, where a stout woman was wiping down the wood. "Excuse me," Cora began, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm looking for work. I can wash dishes, scrub floors, anything. I just need a meal and—" The woman looked up. Her eyes went from Cora's face to the window where the notice board was visible, then back to Cora. The hospitality vanished, replaced by a wall of ice. "We don't hire your kind here," the woman said loudly. The chatter in the diner died down. Every head turned. "My kind?" Cora asked, her voice trembling. "I am a hard worker. I read the papers. Missy, runaway bride, immoral conduct." The woman sneered the words. "We run a decent establishment. Get out before I call the sheriff." Cora backed out, her cheeks burning. She fled down the street, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the steeple of a small white church at the edge of town, a sanctuary. Surely, in the house of God, there would be mercy. She found the local minister, a thin man with spectacles, pruning rose bushes by the rectory. He straightened as she approached, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "Reverend," she said, clutching her hands together. "Please, I have nowhere to go. I have been falsely accused. I just need sanctuary for the night." The minister adjusted his spectacles. He looked at her torn dress, her wind-burned face, and the desperation in her eyes. He did not see a soul in need. He saw a liability. "The church is for the righteous. Child," he said coldly. "Those who run from their duties and live in sin need repentance, not a roof. Go back to your husband, or whoever claims you. We do not harbor fallen women here." He turned his back on her and returned to his roses. Cora stood alone in the dusty street. The sun was fully up now, beating down on her exposed head. She had fled the east to escape a cage, only to find that the bars were made of ink and whispers, and they had followed her all the way to the frontier, miles away, in a valley that the maps of the white men often ignored. Nayati dismounted. This place was a green vein in the dry earth. A creek bubbled over smooth stones, feeding a grove of cottonwood trees that offered shade and song. Nestled against the rock face stood a cabin, not a teepee, but a structure of timber and stone, a compromise between two ways of life. Two small figures burst from the door as his boots touched the ground. Papalena, 4 years old and with eyes like round chestnuts, slammed into his legs, wrapping her arms around his knees. Nayati's hand dropped to her head, his fingers tangling in her dark hair. Behind her stood Asha, 8 years old. She did not run. She stood by the doorframe, watching him with a gaze too old for her face. She held a rag doll by one arm, her posture guarded. She was the one who remembered the most. She was the one who watched the horizon when he was gone. "Is there danger?" Asha asked in the Comanche tongue, her voice small. "No danger today, little bird," Nayati replied in their language, lifting Lena onto his hip. "Just wind and sand." He walked into the cabin. It was clean, but sparse. A cast-iron stove sat cold in the corner, a table with 3 chairs, and on a shelf, high enough to be safe but low enough to be seen, sat a small collection of items that did not belong to a warrior. A silver hairbrush, a piece of embroidery, half finished, the needles still rusted into the fabric, and a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. The face of a woman with pale skin and laughing eyes looked out at the room. Mary. Nayati set Lena down and walked to the shelf. The silence in the room changed. It became heavy with memory. He took a small bundle of dried sage from a hook, lit the end with a match, and let the smoke curl upward. The scent was sharp and cleansing. He closed his eyes, inhaling the smoke. He spoke to the air, his voice a low rumble that the girls knew not to interrupt. "The winter is coming. Mary, the little one forgets your voice. The older one forgets how to smile. And I am forgetting how to be soft." He opened his eyes. The smoke dissipated, leaving nothing but the smell of burnt herbs and the ache in his chest that never fully healed. The saloon in Mesquite Crossing was named the Golden Steer, though there was nothing golden about it save for the whiskey in the bottles. At a corner table, shadowed from the midday glare, 3 men sat in a triangle of power. Sheriff Hank Rourke leaned back, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. He was a man who wore his authority like a bludgeon. Beside him sat his brother, Jedediah Rourke, a man of soft hands and hard eyes, dressed in a suit that cost more than most men in town earned in a year. He represented the Iron Horse, the railroad that was chewing its way toward the Pacific. Across from them sat a newcomer, Reverend Elijah Graves. Elijah was a tall man, skeletal and intense, dressed in severe black. His hands were clasped on the table, long fingers pale and calm. "The survey is clear," Jedediah was saying, tapping a rolled-up map. "The most direct route for the spur line goes right through the canyon. It cuts 20 miles off the trip, but we have a problem. The Indian," Sheriff Rourke grunted. "Nayati Cross. He's got papers for that land, signed by the territorial governor himself some 10 years back for services rendered as a scout. Can't just shoot him." "Every man has a breaking point," Jedediah said, looking at Elijah. "We need him gone. The investors don't like complications. Savage squatters are a complication." Elijah Graves smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. It merely bared his teeth. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a duplicate of the notice hanging outside. He slid it across the table. "God works in mysterious ways. Gentlemen," Elijah said softly, "I traveled 2,000 miles following a thief, a woman who stole her virtue from me, and my peace of mind from the congregation. And as I rode in today, I saw a name on your board." Sheriff Rourke looked at the paper. "The Bennett girl, the whore." "She is not a whore, Sheriff," Elijah corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "She is a vessel of temptation. She is chaotic. And if she is here, then Providence has delivered a tool into our hands." "How does a runaway girl help us get the Indians off the land?" Jedediah asked. Impatient, Elijah tapped a long finger on the table. "You say this savage lives alone with children. 2 girls, half-breeds." The sheriff spat. "A man living alone, with no woman to guide the household. That is a precarious moral situation." Elijah mused. "And if a woman of ill repute were to be associated with him, if the town were to see that his land is a haven for the immoral public sentiment, is a powerful weapon. stronger than a gun. Sometimes, he looked at the two men, his eyes gleaming with a cold, fanatical light. Let us find Miss Bennet. I believe she has a role to play in our little passion play, whether she wishes to or not. Night had fallen over Mesquite Crossing, but it brought no warmth to Cora. She had found a temporary shelter under the overhang of a grain warehouse near the train tracks. It was dirty, smelling of wet oats and rat droppings, but it was out of the wind. She sat on the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to stop the shivering that racked her body. Her stomach gnawed at itself. She had not eaten since yesterday, but the hunger was a dull ache compared to the sharp sting of memory. She closed her eyes and saw the church in Boston. She saw the congregation, rows of black-clad judges. She saw Elijah in the pulpit, his voice booming like thunder, pointing a finger at her. She is ungrateful. She is willful. A woman who refuses her ordained place is a woman who opens the door to the devil. She tempts men with her defiance. He had called her a temptation. He had twisted her refusal to marry him, a man 20 years her senior, a man with ice in his veins, into a moral failing. He had turned her own father against her. Am I, she wondered, her head resting on her knees? Am I truly ruined? Is saying no the same as being a sinner? A tear leaked out, hot and angry. She wiped it away furiously. No, she would not cry for them. Hey, you're there! A rough voice shattered her thoughts. A lantern swung into view. The warehouse owner, a burly man with a thick club, stood over her. I told you about tramps before. No sleeping here. This ain't a charity ward. I'm sorry. Cora scrambled up, grabbing her skirts. I just needed a moment. Get on. Go on. Get it. He swung the club, missing her by inches. Get out of my town. We don't want your kind here. Cora stumbled back, gasping, and ran. She ran past the warehouse, past the edge of the tracks, out into the darkness where the town ended and the wild began. She stopped only when her lungs burned, bending over, hands on her knees, and then the sky opened up. It was rare in the high desert, but when it came, it was torrential. The rain fell in sheets, cold and heavy, soaking her ragged dress in seconds, plastering her hair to her skull. The temperature plummeted. Cora looked around. To her left, the lights of Mesquite Crossing flickered windows she was barred from. Fires she could not share. To her right, the vast, empty darkness of the valley. She was shivering violently now. Her teeth chattered. The water turned the dust beneath her feet into slick mud. She took a step toward the nothingness, away from the town that hated her. If I am to die, she whispered to the rain, let it be where no one can look down on me. She began to walk into the storm, a solitary figure against the deluge, moving blindly toward the only direction that hadn't yet told her no. The rain did not start as a drizzle. It began as a sudden, violent assault, as if the heavens had finally taken note of Cora Bennet and decided that dust and scorn were not punishment enough. The temperature plummeted, turning the high desert night into a freezing void. Cora stumbled, her boots sinking deep into the rapidly forming mud. Her skirts, already torn and heavy with grime, now soaked up the water like a sponge, dragging at her waist, pulling her down. She gripped the rough wood of a fence rail that lined the road leading out of Mesquite Crossing. It was the only thing keeping her upright. Her teeth chattered with a sound that seemed loud in her own skull. She was cold, a bone-deep chill that made her fingers numb and clumsy. But the physical misery was distant, almost secondary to the hollowness inside her chest. She had been cast out, not just from a building, but from humanity. The warehouse owner's club had missed her body, but the message had struck home. She was unwanted. She was a stain. Cora looked down the dark, muddy track. It led nowhere. It led to the open range, to coyotes, to exposure, to death. And for the first time since she had fled Boston, the thought of death did not frighten her. It felt like a cessation, a stopping of the noise, a stopping of the judgment. If no one wants me here, she thought, her mind sluggish and cold, then I will simply disappear. It is simple. I will walk until I cannot walk, and then I will lie down. She pushed herself off the fence rail, her legs trembling. She took one step, then another, moving away from the lights of the town that flickered like cruel, distant stars through the curtain of rain. Behind her, a sound emerged from the storm. It was a rhythmic, wet thudding, hooves striking mud. Cora did not turn around. She did not reach for the small knife hidden in her dress. She did not care. If it was the sheriff coming to arrest her for vagrancy, let him. If it was a bandit coming to cut her throat, let him. At least it would be warm for a moment before the end. The horse drew closer, its breathing heavy and wet in the downpour. It slowed, then stopped directly beside her. The large animal acted as a momentary windbreak, shielding her from the driving rain. A voice cut through the sound of the storm. It was deep, resonant, and devoid of the mockery she had come to expect from men. "You will die if you stand there," the man said. "I do not need another ghost on my land." Cora stopped. She turned her head slowly, water streaming down her face, plastering her hair to her cheeks. It was him, the Comanche warrior. He sat high on his paint horse, water running in rivulets down his bare chest and arms. He wore no coat, only his buckskins, yet he did not seem to be shivering. He looked solid, anchored to the earth in a way she was not. He looked down at her with eyes that were dark and unreadable, judging the situation with a terrifying practicality. Cora stared up at him. The rain lashed against her eyes, making her blink rapidly. "Go away," she whispered, though the wind snatched the words. She tried to speak louder. "Leave me be." Nayati did not move. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearm on the pommel of his saddle. He studied her, the shaking of her shoulders, the blue tinge to her lips, the way she stood with her chin lifted despite the fact that she was drowning in the open air. "I have a proposition for you. Cora Bennett," he said. He knew her name. Of course he knew. The whole town knew. "I have nothing to steal," she said, her voice cracking. "And I have nothing to sell. I am not looking to buy," Nayati replied. His voice was steady, cutting through the panic rising in her throat. "I have 2 daughters. Their mother is gone. The little one cries for a woman's touch, and the older one is forgetting what gentleness looks like." Cora wiped the water from her eyes, confused. "What? I need a mother for my girls," Nayati stated, the words falling between them like heavy stones. "And you need shelter." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Cora stared at him, unable to process the transaction he was offering. "A marriage, a job. My wife died of the fever 2 years ago," Nayati continued, his tone flat, offering no room for pity. "I'm a man who can hunt, fight, and build, but I cannot braid hair. I cannot mend a dress so it looks new. I cannot soften the world for them. I need a woman who does not drink spirits, a woman who does not strike a child in anger, a woman who does not steal." He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her ragged appearance. "You are cold. You are hungry. And you are hunted by the tongues of this town. I offer you a roof. I offer you food. I offer you a bed to sleep in alone. I offer you protection." Cora felt a flash of heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was indignation. He was negotiating for her life, as if he were trading for a horse at an auction. "You speak of me as if I am a tool," she snapped, finding a spark of her old fire. "I am the outcast bride. Have you not seen the posters? Have you not heard what they say? I'm a fallen woman. I am tainted. I am a Comanche," Nayati replied, and for the first time, a hint of dry, dark humor touched his lips. "I have been a savage, a heathen, and a dog in their eyes since the day I drew breath. One more label will not kill me, and your reputation means nothing to the rain. It means nothing to the hunger in your belly." "You want to marry me?" she asked, the absurdity of it suffocating her. "I want a mother for my children," he corrected. "I do not ask for a wife in your bed. I do not ask for your body. I ask for your hands and your time. If you respect my home, I will respect you. That is the offer." Cora looked back toward the town. There was nothing there but hatred and the reverent suffocating judgment. She looked at the dark void of the desert. There was only death. Then she looked at Nayati. He was a stranger. He was of a people she had been told to fear, but he was standing in the rain, offering her a lifeline when her own people had offered her nothing but stones. He was not looking at her with lust, nor with contempt. He was looking at her with a desperate, pragmatic need. He needed help. She needed to survive. The realization washed over her, colder than the rain. This was what her life had come to. A business arrangement on a muddy road at the edge of nowhere. "I will not be a servant," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "And I will not be a prisoner." "You can leave whenever you wish," Nayati said. "But if you leave tonight, you die." Cora closed her eyes for a second, inhaling the scent of wet sage and horse. She thought of the Reverend Elijah Graves and his smug certainty that she would come crawling back, broken and begging for forgiveness. She would not crawl. "I will go with you," Cora said, opening her eyes. She stepped closer to the horse, looking up at him. "But know this, I do not belong to you. I belong to myself." Nayati nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. "I have no desire to own you. Cora Bennett, I only wish to share a roof." He reached down. His hand was large, the palm rough with calluses, warm against the freezing air. Cora took it. He pulled her up with an effortless heave. She swung her leg over the horse's rump, settling behind him. The animal shifted its weight, anxious to be moving. Nayati reached behind him and untied a heavy buffalo hide blanket from his saddle roll. He swung it around, draping it over his broad shoulders and covering her as well. "Hold on," he commanded. Cora hesitated, then wrapped her arms tentatively around his waist. The blanket created a small, enclosed world, shutting out the storm. Inside the cocoon of the heavy hide, the heat was immediate and startling. Her chest was pressed against his back. She was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, and his body acted as a furnace. She could feel the muscles of his back shift as he guided the horse. Through the wet fabric of her dress and his buckskins, she could feel the steady, slow rhythm of his heart. It was a strong, unhurried beat. It was the beat of a man who was alive, a man of flesh and blood. Not the monster the town whispers described. Cora rested her cheek against his back, too exhausted to hold her head up any longer. The smell of him filled the small space wood smoke, rain, and the musk of damp leather. It was not the smell of a gentleman's parlor, laced with cologne and hypocrisy. It was the smell of the earth. "I am riding into the wilderness with a stranger," she thought, the vibration of the horse's gait rattling her teeth. "I am mad, or I am finally free." They left the road. The horse moved with sure-footed confidence, leaving the mud of civilization for the hard-packed earth of the valley trail. The wind howled around them, tearing at the edges of the buffalo robe. But inside, Cora felt a strange, terrifying safety. The storm belonged to the world outside. Under the blanket, there was only the heat of survival. They rode for what felt like hours. The rain began to soften, turning from a deluge to a steady, weeping drizzle. The terrain changed beneath them. The horse's hooves struck stone, then soft turf. The sound of the wind died down, replaced by the rushing sound of water. "We are here," Nayati said. His voice rumbled through his chest, vibrating against her cheek. He stopped the horse. Cora lifted her head, stiff and aching. Nayati pulled back the blanket. Before them lay a small valley, cupped in the hands of the hills like a secret. A creek swollen with rain rushed through the center, and there, nestled near a grove of cottonwoods, was a cabin. It was not a grand house. It was built of rough-hewn logs and mud chinking, low to the ground to avoid the wind, but from the single square window, a warm, orange light spilled out onto the wet grass. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, smelling of cedar and mesquite. To Cora, who had spent months sleeping in wagons, in barns, and on the hard ground, it looked like a palace. It looked like the difference between life and death. "It is not much," Nayati said, swinging his leg over the saddle and dropping to the ground. He reached up for her. "It is dry," Cora murmured. She slid down into his arms. Her legs buckled when they hit the ground, numb from the cold and the ride. Nayati caught her, his hands gripping her elbows, steadying her until she found her balance. For a second, they stood close in the dark, the light from the window catching the planes of his face. He looked at her, and she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, quickly masked. He was bringing a strange white woman into his sanctuary. He was taking a risk as great as hers. "Come," he said. "The girls will be awake." He pushed open the heavy wooden door. The warmth hit Cora like a physical blow, smelling of roasting meat and dry pine. The room was simple. A hearth dominated one wall, where a fire crackled cheerfully. A table, a few chairs, and shelves lined with practical goods. And in the center of the room, two pairs of eyes stared at her. The older girl, Asha, stood in front of the younger one, her stance defensive. She was a beautiful child, with her father's dark eyes and high cheekbones, but her expression was fierce. Her hands gripped a rag doll so tightly that the fabric was twisted. She looked at Cora not with curiosity, but with a deep, instinctive suspicion. Behind her, peeking out from the folds of Asha's skirt, was the little one, Lena. She looked to be about 4. Her eyes were wide and terrified, darting from her father to the dripping, bedraggled woman standing in the doorway. She let out a small whimper and buried her face in her sister's back. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the popping of the fire. Cora felt water dripping from her hem onto the dirt floor. She felt acutely aware of her appearance, her matted hair, her ruined dress, the mud on her face. She was an intruder here. She was a ghost from a world that had rejected these children. Nayati stepped forward, moving past Cora to hang his rifle on the wall. He did not go to hug them immediately. He seemed to respect the tension in the room. He turned to his daughters, speaking in English, perhaps for Cora's benefit. "Asha, Lena," he said softly. He gestured toward Cora with an open hand. "This is Cora," Nayati said. "He did not say, 'This is your new mother.' He did not say, 'This is my wife.' He kept his promise. She will be staying here for a while." Cora took a hesitant step forward. She forced her frozen lips into a smile. Though she felt it waver, she looked at the two little girls, seeing the hunger for affection warring with the fear of abandonment in their eyes. "Hello?" Cora whispered. Asha did not smile. She pulled Lena closer, taking a step back, her dark eyes narrowing. She looked at Cora's white skin, her blue eyes, and the wreckage of her clothes. She judged the stranger and found her wanting. The little girl, Lena, peeked out again. She stared at the puddle of water forming around Cora's boots. She said nothing. Nayati looked from his daughters to Cora. For a moment, the weight of what he had done seemed to press down on his shoulders. He had brought the storm inside. "There is stew in the pot," Nayati said to the room at large, breaking the standoff. "And blankets in the chest." He walked to the fire to warm his hands, leaving Cora standing near the door, shivering, watched by two silent children in a house that was not her home, but was the only shelter she had left in the world. The first week in the valley was a lesson in humility, written in smoke and blistered skin. Cora Bennett had been raised in a world of polished wood floors, whale oil lamps, and servants who ensured the hearth was never cold. Here, in the shadow of the red rock cliffs, survival was a negotiation with the elements. And Cora was losing the argument. The morning air was crisp, carrying the bite of the coming winter. Inside the cabin, Cora knelt before the stone hearth, her face smudged with soot. She struck the flint against the steel for the 10th time, sparks dying before they could catch the tinder. The wood Nayati had brought in was slightly damp from the storm that had brought her here, and it refused to yield. From the corner of the room, Asha watched. The 8-year-old girl sat cross-legged on a buffalo rug, threading dried berries onto a string. She did not speak, but her dark eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She watched Cora blow frantically on a tiny ember until her face turned red, only for the spark to wink out into gray ash. "You are smothering it?" a deep voice said from the doorway. Cora jumped, dropping the flint. Nayati stood there, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. He did not look angry, merely resigned. He walked over, the scent of pine and fresh blood clinging to his buckskins. "Fire needs to breathe. Cora, like a man. If you crowd it, it dies." He knelt beside her. His hands were large and scarred. yet they moved with a delicacy that shamed her clumsy efforts. He rearranged the kindling, creating a small tent of twigs that allowed the air to circulate. With a single strike of the flint and a patient, steady breath, the fire roared to life, chasing the chill from the room. Cora sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am trying," she said, defensive. "I have never had to build a fire from damp wood before." "The land does not care what you have done before," Nayati said, standing up. "It only cares what you can do now. If you cannot make fire, you freeze. If you cannot tell the difference between the track of a wolf and the track of a dog, you bleed." He walked to the table and laid the rabbits down. "Come, I will show you how to skin them. You must learn to separate the meat from the fur without piercing the gut." Cora felt her stomach turn, but she stood up. She caught Asha's gaze. The girl looked at her father's back, then at Cora, her expression unreadable. It was not hatred. Cora realized. It was an assessment. The girl was waiting to see if the white woman would break. Later that afternoon, while Nayati was checking the horses in the corral, Cora sought to make herself useful by organizing the heavy wooden chest that sat at the foot of the bed she slept in alone, while Nayati slept on a pallet near the door. She opened the lid, expecting to find linens or wool. Instead, she found the suspended life of another woman. They were dresses of calico and cotton, folded with care. There was a silver hairbrush with strands of pale hair still caught in the bristles. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue, was a piece of embroidery. Cora lifted it gently. It was a partially finished bodice for a child's dress, sized for a toddler. The needle was still rusted into the fabric, anchoring a thread of blue silk. The pattern was a mix of Eastern roses and Comanche geometric shapes, two worlds stitched together by a hand that would never finish the work. This belonged to Mary. Cora felt like an intruder. She was breathing the air this woman had breathed, cooking in her pot, tending to her children. She realized with a sudden sharp clarity that she was not just a housekeeper or a convenient solution. She was a replacement. She was standing in a space carved out by a love she did not understand, trying to fill a silhouette that was not her own. "Pretty," a small voice whispered. Cora started. Lena, the 4-year-old, was standing by her elbow. The little girl reached out a chubby hand to touch the blue thread. "Mama made this," Lena said. She did not sound sad, only matter-of-fact. "For me." Cora's heart ached. She carefully wrapped the embroidery back in the tissue and placed it deep in the chest. "Yes," Cora said softly. "It is very beautiful. Lena, we must keep it safe." She closed the lid. She would not try to be Mary. She could only be Cora, and she hoped that would be enough. The true test came 3 nights later, when the moon was hidden behind thick clouds and the valley was swallowed by ink-black darkness. A sound tore through the silence, a high, undulating howl that raised the hair on Cora's arms. It was followed by another, and then a chorus of yips and barks that sounded terrifyingly close to the cabin. Wolves. Nayati was out of his bed in a heartbeat. He grabbed the Winchester from the wall, his movements fluid and silent. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice low. "Bar the door behind me." He slipped out into the night. Cora rushed to drop the heavy wooden bar into place, her heart hammering against her ribs. From the corner bed, a wail rose up. Lena was sitting up, her eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down her face. "The monsters!" she screamed. "The monsters are coming!" Asha was sitting up too, clutching her rag doll, trying to look brave but trembling violently. Cora did not think. She crossed the room and climbed onto the bed, gathering both girls into her arms. She pulled the heavy quilt up over their heads, creating a tent, a fortress against the sounds of the night. Outside, a gunshot cracked, loud and sharp. Then another. Lena shrieked, burying her face in Cora's chest. Cora held them tighter, rocking back and forth. "Hush now," Cora whispered, fighting to keep her own voice steady. "Your father is the strongest warrior in the world. The wolves are just singing because they know they cannot come in here." "I am scared," Lena sobbed. Shall I tell you a story? Cora asked, desperate to drown out the sounds of the struggle outside. A story about a girl who lived in a tower of glass. She began to speak, weaving a tale from her childhood, but changing the details. Instead of a prince, the girl in the story was saved by a great eagle. Instead of a glass slipper, she had boots that could walk over thorns without making a sound. Slowly, Lena's sobbing turned to hiccups. She listened, her breathing syncing with Cora's, and then Cora felt a weight on her shoulder. Asha, the girl who had watched her with suspicion for days, the girl who had refused to speak to her, had leaned her head against Cora's arm. Asha's eyes were closed, feigning sleep, but her small hand was gripping the fabric of Cora's sleeve so tightly her knuckles were white. Cora continued to speak, her voice a low hum in the dark cabin, telling the story until the gunshots ceased and the heavy boots of Nayati crunched on the porch. When he knocked the secret rhythm on the door, Cora untangled herself gently. She opened the door to find him standing there, the rifle in the crook of his arm, smelling of gunpowder and cold air. He looked past her to the bed, where the two girls were now sleeping, huddled together in the warmth she had left behind. He looked back at Cora, and his eyes softened. The warrior's mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second, revealing a father's relief. Two of them, he said quietly. They were after the foal. They are gone now. The girls are safe, Cora replied. I see that, Nayati said. You did well, Cora. It was the first time he had used her name without it sounding like a transaction. Supplies ran low by the second week. They needed salt, flour, and coffee. That meant going to Mesquite Crossing. Nayati prepared the wagon. You do not have to come, he said as he hitched the paint horse. I can go alone? I am not a prisoner, Cora said, tying her bonnet tight under her chin and pulling the brim low. And I will not hide forever. The ride into town was tense. As the buildings of Mesquite Crossing came into view, Cora felt her stomach twist. The last time she had been here, she had walked out into the rain to die. They pulled the wagon up to the general store. The street was busy with midday traffic cowboys drifting in from the range, miners, and townspeople. Conversations died as Nayati stepped down from the wagon box. The silence rippled outward like a wave. Then, heads turned toward Cora. She kept her chin high as she descended, refusing to look at the ground. She walked beside Nayati toward the store entrance. Well, I'll be damned, a voice sneered. Sheriff Hank Rourke stood on the boardwalk, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He looked Cora up and down with a mixture of disgust and amusement. If it isn't the runaway bride, the sheriff announced loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd could hear. We thought the coyotes had picked your bones clean, Miss Bennett, but it looks like you found a different kind of pack to run with. Cora stopped. Her face burned. Good day, Sheriff, she said icily. Is it? Rourke stepped closer, blocking their path. He ignored Nayati completely, focusing his malice on her. You know, there are laws against decency in this territory. A white woman living in a shack with a savage. Folks might get the wrong idea. Or maybe the right one. A woman coming out of the church gasped, clutching her Bible. It is her, the one from the poster, living in sin with that heathen. Come, Nayati said. His voice was calm, but Cora saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hand hovered near his knife, not touching it, but ready. He did not engage the sheriff. To engage was to give them the excuse they wanted. He steered Cora around the sheriff and into the general store. The interior was cool and smelled of spices and dry goods. Mrs. Harlow, the widow who owned the shop, stood behind the counter. She was a stern woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were kind. She watched the door as the jeers from the street drifted in. Cora placed her list on the counter. Just these items. Please, Mrs. Harlow, if my money is still good here. Mrs. Harlow looked at the list, then at Cora. She began to pull the items from the shelves, a sack of flour, a bag of coffee beans, a block of salt. As she packed them into a crate, She reached into a glass jar on the counter and pulled out a small bag of peppermint sugar sticks. She tucked them discreetly into the sack of flour. "For the little ones, Mrs." Harlow murmured, her voice barely audible. Then she leaned over the counter, pretending to check the ledger. "Don't let them tell you who you are, child. Ink on paper doesn't make a person. Actions do." Cora felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. "Best you go out the back." "Mrs." Harlow added loud enough for Nayati to hear. "Load up from the alley. Less noise that way." The ride back to the valley was silent. The sky was vast and indifferent, a brilliant blue that mocked the ugliness of the town they had left behind. "You should not go back there alone," Nayati said finally. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "I can handle staring," Cora said, though her hands were still trembling in her lap. "It starts with staring," Nayati said. His voice was heavy with a pain she had not heard before. "Then comes the spitting. Then the refusal to sell medicine when a fever burns hot." Cora looked at him. "Mary." Nayati nodded. "She was strong. Stronger than you. Stronger than me. But hatred is a slow poison. They made her feel ashamed for loving me. And when the sickness came, the doctor was too busy to come to the valley." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes fierce. "I will not let them do that to you. I brought you here to save you from the rain, not to throw you into the fire." "I am not Mary," Cora said softly. She reached out, her hand hovering over his arm, then resting on the buckskin sleeve. "And I am not leaving. Nayati, they can stare all they want, but this valley, it is the first place I have slept without fear in months." Nayati looked at her hand on his arm. He did not pull away. A few days later, the intimacy of their strange arrangement deepened, not with words, but with blood. Nayati had been wrestling a calf that had gotten tangled in a patch of cholla cactus. He had freed the animal, but a long, jagged tear had opened up on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly. He sat at the table that evening, trying to clean it with one hand, his movements awkward. "Let me," Cora said. She brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. Nayati hesitated, then laid his arm on the table. Cora washed the wound carefully. The skin around the cut was dark and smooth, the muscle beneath hard as iron. As she dabbed at the blood, she felt the heat of him radiating against her fingers. She looked up. Nayati was watching her. He was not looking at the wound. He was looking at her face, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her mouth. The cabin seemed to shrink. The air grew thick and heavy. The smell of the wood smoke mixed with the scent of soap from her hair and the musk of his skin. Cora's breath hitched. She should pull away. She should finish the bandage and retreat to her side of the room, but her fingers lingered on his wrist, feeling the strong, steady pulse of his blood. It is a deep scratch," she stammered, her voice breathless. "It is nothing," Nayati murmured. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. He did not move his arm. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The space between them crackled with an unspoken question, a realization that they were a man and a woman alone in the wilderness, bound by survival, and something else that was beginning to take root in the silence. Nayati cleared his throat and pulled his arm back slowly. "Thank you," he said gruffly. "You are welcome," Cora whispered, while the fire crackled in the cabin in the valley. A different kind of fire was being kindled in the Golden Steer Saloon. A stagecoach had arrived from the east, carrying mail, supplies, and a passenger who stepped onto the dusty street like a shadow detaching itself from the night. Reverend Elijah Graves brushed the dust from his black coat. He carried a heavy leather Bible in one hand and a silver-headed cane in the other. His face was gaunt, his eyes burning with the fervor of a man who believed he was the right hand of God. He walked into the saloon, the sudden silence marking his passage. He approached the table where Sheriff Rourke and his brother Jedediah sat. "Reverend," Jedediah said, nodding, "you had a good time." "The Lord's work allows for no delay," Elijah said smoothly. He accepted the glass of water the barman hurriedly placed before him. Ignoring the whiskey, "She is here." Rourke grunted. I saw her myself 2 days ago, bold as brass, riding in a wagon with the Indian, acting like she belongs to him." Elijah's lips curled into a smile that was terrifying in its serenity. "Excellent," he said softly. "I was worried she might have perished, but this is better." He walked to the window and looked out toward the dark hills to the west. He could not see the cabin, but he knew it was there. He could feel it, like a splinter in his mind. "She thinks she has found a sanctuary," Elijah whispered to the reflection in the glass. "But she has only dug a trap for herself, and for him." He turned back to the men, his eyes gleaming. "We will not just bring her back. Gentlemen, we will use her to cleanse this land, the Indian's immorality in harboring a fallen woman. It will be the lever we use to pry him from that valley. And when we are done, there will be nothing left of them but ashes and scripture." The descent into winter brought a biting chill to the air, but it was nothing compared to the frost that settled over Mesquite Crossing when Cora Bennett dared to enter the town again. Supplies were necessary: the flannel for winter coats, the thread to mend the girls' torn shifts, and the simple need for fresh flour could not be ignored. Nayati had been reluctant to let her go, but he was busy reinforcing the corral against the coming snows. He had sent her with the wagon and a warning to keep her head down. Cora did as she was told. She moved like a shadow through the dusty streets, pulling her bonnet low. She tied the horse outside the general store and hurried inside, grateful for Mrs. Harlow's silent, stoic nod as she measured out the fabric. It was when she stepped back out onto the boardwalk, her arms full of brown paper parcels, that the trap sprung. Cora! The name was spoken not with anger, but with a sickening, melodic familiarity. It was a voice that had haunted her nightmares for 6 months. Cora froze. The parcels nearly slipped from her numb fingers. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach like lead. Reverend Elijah Graves stood in the middle of the street, leaning elegantly on his silver-headed cane. He was immaculate in his black suit, a stark contrast to the red dust that coated everything else in this God-forsaken territory. He looked at her with eyes that gleamed with a predatory warmth. "My wayward dove," Elijah said, his voice projecting clearly so that every passerby stopped to listen. "I have found you at last." A crowd began to gather. The blacksmith set down his hammer. 2 women sweeping their porches paused. They watched the theater unfold, hungry for the scandal they had read about on the wanted posters. "Leave me be." "Elijah," Cora said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to be brave. "I have nothing to say to you." Elijah took a step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of benevolent forgiveness. "But I have so much to say to you. Child, look at you. Ragged, thin, living among heathens." He turned to the crowd, his face twisting into a mask of pious sorrow. This woman was promised to God. She was promised a life of virtue, but the devil is a cunning whisperer. He led her into the desert, into the arms of a savage. "He is not a savage," Cora snapped, stepping off the boardwalk. Anger flared hot enough to burn away her fear. "He is a better man than you will ever be." The crowd gasped. To defend a Comanche against a man of God was blasphemy in Mesquite Crossing. Elijah smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. "You hear her?" he called out to the onlookers. "The darkness has taken hold of her tongue. She abandons her own kind to lay with a beast. She rejects salvation for sin." He looked back at Cora, his voice dropping to a hiss that only she could hear. "You think you are free. Cora, you are merely lost. And I am the shepherd who will drag you back to the flock, even if I have to break your legs to keep you there." "I would rather die," Cora whispered. "That can be arranged," Elijah replied pleasantly. "But first, there is the matter of penance." He tipped his hat, turned on his heel, and walked away, leaving Cora standing in the street, stripped naked by the judging eyes of 50 strangers. She scrambled into the wagon, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and whipped the horses into a gallop, fleeing the town as if the very air were poisoned. In the back room of the Golden Steer Saloon, the air was thick with cigar smoke and conspiracy. Sheriff Hank Rourke poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a glass and slid it across the table to his brother, Jedediah. Elijah Graves declined the spirits, sipping instead from a glass of water, his posture rigid. "The girl is broken," Elijah stated calmly. "I saw it in her eyes. She is terrified, but she is stubborn." "Stubborn don't matter," Jedediah grunted. He spread a map of the territory on the table. A thick red line was drawn right through the green valley where Nayati's cabin stood. "The railroad investors are getting impatient. They want the survey crews in there by spring. That Indian holding the deed is a thorn in my side that needs pulling. We can't just shoot him." "Jed," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. "I told you, the territorial governor signed that land over to him after the Apache Wars. If we kill him without cause, it brings federal marshals. I don't need federal eyes on my town." Elijah placed his hand flat on the table. His fingers were long and pale, like the legs of a spider. "We do not need bullets," the Reverend said softly. "We have the law, and we have morality." "Explain," Jedediah demanded. "The Indian has children," Elijah said. "2 young girls, living in isolation, no mother. And now, he harbors a woman of known ill repute, a woman wanted for immoral conduct across 3 states. The sheriff frowned. Then slowly, a grin spread across his face. "Unfit environment." "Precisely," Elijah nodded. "Under the Territorial Custody Act of 1872, the state has the right to remove minors from an environment deemed physically or morally dangerous. Living with a savage father and a fugitive harlot, no judge in this country would let those children stay there." "And if we take the kids?" Jedediah asked. "If you take the children," Elijah said, "the Indian will break. He will do anything to get them back. He will trade the land. He will leave the territory. Or he will become violent." Elijah's eyes glittered. "And if he becomes violent, then the sheriff has every right to put a bullet in him in self-defense." The 3 men sat in silence, contemplating the elegance of the cruelty. It was a plan that used a man's love for his children as the weapon to destroy him. "I will draw up the petition," Elijah said, standing up. "God's will be done." The storm came 3 nights later, a howling gale that swept down from the mountains, carrying the first bite of true winter. The wind screamed around the corners of the cabin, rattling the heavy wooden door on its hinges. Inside, the fire was the only defense against the cold. Nayati had built it high, the flames casting dancing shadows against the log walls. Lena was terrified. The wind sounded like the wolves from the week before. She refused to sleep in her own bed, sobbing until Nayati lifted her. "Come," he said gently. "You can sleep near the fire." He laid out the heavy buffalo robes near the hearth. Cora brought her quilt. It was not a decision they discussed. It was a necessity born of the child's fear and the biting cold. They lay down on the floor, the little girl positioned between them. Lena curled into a tight ball, her thumb in her mouth, clutching Cora's sleeve with one hand and her father's shirt with the other. Slowly, the child's breathing evened out as she fell into a fitful sleep. Cora lay on her side, staring over Lena's head at Nayati. He was awake, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. He looked weary. The strain of the last few weeks, the constant vigilance, the repair work, the knowledge that the town was circling like vultures had etched deep lines around his mouth, beneath the heavy furs. The space was small and intimate. Cora shifted slightly to pull the blanket higher over Lena's shoulder, as she did. Her hand brushed against Nayati's. He did not pull away. His hand was warm, the skin rough with calluses but radiating a steady, comforting heat. Her fingers, smaller and paler, rested against his knuckles. It was an accidental touch, born of the confined space, yet neither of them moved to break the contact. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound. But under the blanket, the silence was heavy with unspoken things. Cora could feel the rhythm of his breathing. She could smell the soap he used, the scent of cedar smoke in his hair. It was a violation of their agreement. They were supposed to be partners in survival, nothing more. but as her fingers curled slightly, brushing his palm, she felt a jolt of longing so sharp it frightened her. It was not just a desire for touch. It was a desire to be held, to be known, to be safe. "Cora," Nayati whispered. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the fire. "I'm here," she whispered back. He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing loosely with hers. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, shocking in its simplicity. He squeezed her hand, once, firmly. "Go to sleep," he murmured. "The wind cannot reach you here." She closed her eyes, her hand anchored in his. For the first time in her life, she felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Sleep, however, was elusive. An hour later, Cora lay awake, the weight of Elijah's words in town pressing down on her chest. Wayward dove, sinner, temptation. She gently extricated her hand from Nayati's grasp and sat up, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. She stared into the dying embers. "You are thinking loud enough to wake the dead," Nayati said softly. He was watching her, propped up on one elbow. Lena was sound asleep between them, a small bridge of innocence. "I met Elijah in town," Cora said. The confession tumbled out before she could stop it. "The Reverend, he spoke to me." Nayati sat up slowly, careful not to disturb his daughter. "What did he say?" "He told the town I was a sinner," Cora said, her voice bitter. "He called me a whore. He said I abandoned my virtue to live with a beast." She looked at Nayati, tears stinging her eyes. "He made them hate me. And by extension, he made them hate you more." "They did not need his help to hate me," Nayati said dryly. "But you do not know the truth," Cora whispered. She hugged her knees to her chest. "Everyone thinks I ran away with actors and gamblers because I am loose, because I have no morals." She took a deep breath, the shame burning her cheeks even in the dim light. "I have never been with a man. Nayati, not once. Elijah. He was arranged to marry me by my father. He was 40 and I was 22. He wanted a trophy, not a wife. When I refused him, when I said I would not marry a man I did not love, he stood in the pulpit and told the congregation I was a temptress. He said I had seduced the stable boys. He said my refusal was proof of my corruption." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "He destroyed my name because he could not own my body. So I ran. I ran because it was the only way to keep the one thing that was truly mine." Nayati listened in silence. He did not look at her with the pity she hated, nor the lust she feared. He looked at her with a deep, solemn respect. "Words are wind," Nayati said. "I do not care what a man in a black coat says about you. I see you, Cora. I see how you braid Asha's hair. I see how you tend the fire. I see how you stood in the rain rather than beg." He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tear track. "You are not a sinner," he said firmly. "You are a survivor, and in this land, that is the only virtue that matters." Cora leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "I'm afraid I will bring his wrath down on you. On the girls. Let us speak of wrath," Nayati said, his voice hardening slightly. He withdrew his hand and looked into the fire. "Do you know why Mary died?" Cora shook her head. "You said it was the fever." "It was," Nayati said. "But it was a fever that medicine could have broken. When she fell ill, the snow was deep. I rode to Mesquite Crossing. I went to the doctor's house. I pounded on his door until my knuckles bled." He paused, his jaw working as he fought down the old rage. The doctor looked out his window. He saw a Comanche. He saw the husband of the woman who had shamed the white race by marrying a savage. He told me he was closed. He told me to go to the horse doctor if I wanted treatment. Nayati's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "I rode back. I held her while she burned. I listened to her breathing stop. She died because they punished her for loving me." He looked at Cora, his eyes blazing with a mixture of grief and defiance. "I blamed the sky. I blamed the earth. I wanted to burn that town to the ground, but I had Asha and Lena. I had to live." "We are the same," Cora whispered. The realization settled over her. "We are both punished for daring to choose our own lives." "Yes," Nayati said, "and that is why we will not let them win." The blow fell 2 days later. A deputy from the sheriff's office rode out to the valley. He did not dismount. He looked nervous, his hand hovering near his gun, eyeing Nayati, who stood on the porch with his rifle in the crook of his arm. "Got a paper for you. Cross," the deputy called out, tossing a rolled document onto the dirt. "And for the woman." He spurred his horse and galloped away as if the devil were snapping at his heels. Nayati walked out and picked up the paper. Cora came out of the cabin, wiping flour from her hands. She saw the seal of the territorial court. Nayati read it, his face turning to granite. "What is it?" Cora asked, fear clutching her heart. "A summons," Nayati said, his voice flat. "A hearing regarding the welfare of Asha and Lena Cross, petitioned by Reverend Elijah Graves and supported by Sheriff Hank Rourke." He handed the paper to her. Cora scanned the legal jargon, the words blurring before her eyes. Moral turpitude, unfit guardianship, immediate custody transfer to the state. The world spun. "They want the girls," Cora breathed. "Because of me." "They want the land," Nayati corrected. "The girls are just the key to the lock. But yes, they are using your name as the hammer." Cora crushed the paper in her hand. "I have to leave." She turned and ran back into the cabin. She began to throw her few belongings into the battered trunk. "I have to go. If I am not here, they have no case. If I leave, the immoral influence is gone." "Cora, stop," Nayati said from the doorway. "I cannot let them take your children," Cora cried, spinning around. She was frantic, her hair flying wild. "I am the poison. Nayati, don't you see Elijah is doing this to get to me, and he is destroying you to do it? If I leave tonight, I can draw him away." "If you run," Nayati said, stepping into the room. "You prove them right. You prove that you are guilty. You prove that this home is broken. I don't care what they think of me." Cora shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I care about Asha. I care about Lena. I love them." The confession hung in the air. She loved them. She had been there a month, but they had burrowed into her heart like seedlings in the spring soil. Nayati crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed her shoulders, stopping her frantic movements. "Look at me," he commanded. Cora looked up, sobbing. "If you leave," Nayati said, his voice fierce and low, "you leave them without a mother. You leave me without my partner." He gripped her arms tighter. "They want to break us. They want to separate us so they can pick us off one by one. The only way we keep this land, the only way we keep the girls, is if we stand together, as a family." "But we are not a family," Cora wept. "We are just 2 outcasts hiding in a valley." "Then we make it true," Nayati said. "You stood in the rain and took my hand. You stood between my daughters and the wolves. You are not a guest here. Cora." He looked deep into her eyes, stripping away her defenses. "You are my wife," he said. The word was heavy, solemn, and absolute. Not on paper, not in their church, but before the earth and before me. "You are my wife." Cora stopped trembling. She looked at this man, this warrior who had lost everything and was fighting to keep what little remained. She saw the fear behind his strength. He needed her. Not just to cook and clean, but to stand beside him when the world came with its court orders and its guns. She took a deep breath, wiping her face with her apron. She looked at the trunk, then back at Nayati. "If we fight," she said, her voice steadying. "We fight to win. We fight to win," Nayati agreed. "Then I am not running," Cora said. "I will stand before that judge, and I will tell them exactly who Reverend Elijah Graves is." Nayati nodded, releasing her shoulders. He stepped back, but the connection between them remained, taut as a bowstring. Outside, the clouds gathered over the peaks, dark and purple. The creek roared, swollen with the meltwater of early snow. The storm was coming, not of wind and rain this time, but of law and lies. But inside the cabin, for the first time, there was no hesitation. There was only the quiet, dangerous resolve of a family preparing for war. The smell of smoke did not drift in gradually. It hit Cora with the sudden, acrid violence of a warning shot. It was long past midnight. The wind outside had died down, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence over the valley. Cora sat up in her bed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The air in the cabin was thick, not with the comforting scent of the hearth, but with the oily, stinging stench of burning tar and dry pine. From the darkness outside came a sound that froze the blood in her veins, the high-pitched, terrifying scream of a horse in panic. "Nayati!" Cora screamed, throwing off her quilt, but Nayati was already moving. He was a blur of motion in the dark, grabbing his rifle and the heavy water bucket by the door. "Stay here!" he roared, kicking the door open. The rush of air fed the beast outside. Through the open door, the night was painted in hues of violent orange and bruised purple. The barn, the structure Nayati had built with his own hands. The shelter for their livestock was engulfed in flames. Cora did not stay. She pulled her boots on with trembling hands and ran out into the yard. The heat was physical, a wall that pushed against her chest. The dry timber of the barn was crackling like gunfire. Sparks spiraled up into the black sky, joining the stars. Through the roar of the fire, she heard the hoofbeats of riders fading into the distance, accompanied by a cruel, raucous laughter that chilled her more than the winter air. Nayati was near the corral gate, trying to beat back the flames with a wet blanket, shouting in Comanche to the animals trapped inside. The milk cow had broken through the fence, but the Paint Nayati's warhorse, the living connection to his past as a warrior, was trapped in the far stall, kicking wildly against the wood. "The roof will hold for a moment," Nayati shouted over the roar, turning to run toward the creek for more water. "Keep the girls back." Cora looked at the barn. She saw the terror in the horse's eyes through the slats. And then she remembered the saddlebags, the leather satchel hanging on the post near the stall. It contained the ferrotypes of Mary, the silver locket, and the papers proving Nayati's ownership of the land. If those burned, the memories burned. If the papers burned, Elijah Graves won without a trial. Cora grabbed a bucket of water standing near the trough. She did not throw it on the fire. She poured it over her own head and shoulders, gasping as the icy water soaked her nightdress. She wrapped her woolen shawl around her face and ran toward the barn door. "Cora, no!" Nayati's voice was a ragged tear in the night, distant and terrified. She ignored him. She ducked her head and plunged into the inferno. Inside, the air was unbreathable. Smoke billowed in thick, gray clouds, stinging her eyes until they streamed tears. The heat was blistering, singing the hair on her arms. The paint was rearing, its hooves smashing against the stall door. Cora coughed, bending low. She reached the post. Her fingers fumbled with the leather straps of the satchel, the metal buckles searing hot against her skin. She yanked it free, slinging it over her shoulder. Then she turned to the stall. "Easy," she choked out, though the horse could not hear her. She threw the latch open. The horse bolted, 1,000 pounds of terrified muscle knocking her sideways. Cora fell hard into the dirt and straw. Above her, a groan of timber signaled the end. A burning crossbeam, eaten through by the hungry flames, detached from the ceiling. Cora rolled. She moved on instinct, scrambling through the dirt. The beam crashed down, missing her skull by inches, but the end of it caught her left arm. A scream tore from her throat, a raw, primal sound of agony as the fire kissed her flesh. The smell of singed fabric and skin filled her nose. She kicked out, adrenaline flooding her system. Pushing the heavy wood away with a strength she did not know she possessed, she scrambled toward the rectangle of darkness that was the door. She collapsed onto the cool earth of the yard just as the roof caved in with a thunderous crash, sending a fountain of sparks high into the air. Hands were on her instantly. Strong, desperate hands. "Cora, Cora, look at me!" Nayati dragged her further from the heat. Dropping to his knees beside her, his face was streaked with soot, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the woman lying in the mud. "I got them," she rasped, clutching the leather satchel to her chest with her good hand. "The papers, Mary." Nayati did not look at the bag. He looked at her left arm, where the sleeve was burned away, revealing angry, red, blistering skin. "Asha," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "Bring the water and the salve now." He gathered Cora into his arms, rocking her slightly. He was trembling. The warrior who could face down cavalry charges was shaking like a leaf in the wind. "You foolish woman," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You foolish, brave woman." "I couldn't let them take it," Cora whispered, the pain beginning to radiate in waves that made her vision swim. "I couldn't let them win." Nayati pressed his forehead against hers. "I do not care about the papers," he said fiercely. "I cannot bear to lose another person. Cora, do not do that again. Do not ever do that again." The sun rose on the day of the hearing, indifferent to the tragedies of the night. It shone brightly on Mesquite Crossing, illuminating the gathered crowd outside the makeshift courthouse, which was, in truth, the large common room of the town hall. Cora sat on the bench of the wagon as they rode into town. Her left arm was heavily bandaged, a sling holding it close to her body. Her face was pale, drawn with pain and lack of sleep, but her eyes were dry. She wore her best dress, the one she had mended carefully by firelight. Nayati drove the wagon. He wore a dark suit coat over a clean shirt. Though he kept his hair braided Comanche style, he looked formidable, a man carved from granite and suppressed rage. As they stepped down, the crowd parted. There were murmurs, some of hostility, some of curiosity. They saw the burns on Cora's face, the bandages on her arm. They saw the soot that still stained Nayati's hands despite his scrubbing. Inside, the room was stifling. Judge Ruiz sat behind a heavy oak table. He was a man of Mexican descent, with a lined face and eyes that had seen too much of the territory's lawlessness to be easily impressed. To the right sat Reverend Elijah Graves, flanked by Sheriff Rourke and Jedediah. Elijah looked fresh, rested, and painfully righteous. He smiled sadly at Cora as she entered, a gesture that made her want to scream. "This hearing is in session," Judge Ruiz announced, his gavel striking the wood with a dull thud. "The matter at hand is the petition for the removal of the minors Asha and Lena Cross from the custody of their father, Nayati Cross, due to allegations of moral turpitude and unsafe living conditions." Elijah Graves stood up. He did not need notes. He spoke with the cadence of a sermon, his voice rising and falling to capture the room. "Your Honor," Elijah began, turning to face the packed room, "we are not here to persecute. We are here to protect. The Lord tells us that the innocent must be shepherded." He pointed a long finger at the table where Cora and Nayati sat. "This man," Elijah said, "lives in squalor. He drags these children up with pagan rituals, denying them a Christian education. And now he brings a woman into his bed who is known across the eastern states as a fallen angel, a woman who fled her own wedding, a woman who travels with gamblers and thieves." Elijah walked toward Cora, stopping just short of her. "Look at her," he commanded the room. "Battered, burned. Is this the guardian we want for innocent children? A woman who brings fire and destruction wherever she goes last night. God's judgment fell upon their house in the form of flames. It is a sign, Your Honor, the valley is no place for children." The crowd murmured their agreement. Heads nodded. The narrative was simple, clean, and damning. Judge Ruiz looked at Nayati. "Mr. Cross, you may speak." Before Nayati could stand, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "I wish to speak." Heads turned. Mrs. Harlow, the widow who owned the general store, stood up. She clutched her handbag tightly, her knuckles white, but her chin was high. "This is irregular," Elijah snapped. "I will hear her," Judge Ruiz said, leaning forward. "Mrs." Harlow walked to the front. She did not look at the sheriff, who was glaring at her. She looked at the judge. "I run the mercantile," she said clearly. "I see everyone who comes and goes, and I have seen Cora Bennett with those girls." She took a breath. "I have seen her buy flannel to make them warm clothes when she could have bought silk for herself. I have seen her buy peppermint sticks with her last pennies to make them smile. She does not drink. She pays her debts. And those girls, They hold her hand like she is the anchor of their world. She turned to glare at Elijah. You speak of Christian charity, Reverend, but I saw you turn her away when she was starving. Who is the savage here? The man who took her in, or the man who hunted her down? A ripple of uneasy silence went through the room. Then, the heavy boots of the German blacksmith, Herr Schmidt, sounded on the floorboards. He stood up, a giant of a man with soot in his beard. My daughter, Schmidt rumbled, his accent thick. She plays with the little cross girls. Since the woman came, the little ones, they laugh again. They are clean. They are fed. To take them away. He shook his head. Das ist falsch. It is wrong. The wall of prejudice was not broken, but it was cracked. Mr. Cross, Judge Ruiz asked again. Nayati stood. He did not pace like Elijah. He stood still, a tower of silence that commanded attention. The Reverend asks if I know what kind of woman Cora Bennett is, Nayati began. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. I do not know who she was in Boston. I do not care about the papers on the church door. He looked down at Cora, then back at the judge. I know that before she came. My house was cold. My daughters woke up screaming in the night because they missed their mother. I know that I was a man who looked at the horizon and saw only emptiness. He placed his hand on the table, near Cora's bandaged arm. Since she walked into the rain to join us, my daughters slept through the night. They have learned to read. They have learned that a hand raised is not always a hand that strikes. Nayati turned to face the crowd, his eyes locking with the sheriff's, then Elijah's. You call her a whore. You call her a danger. Last night, when men cowards who hide in the dark set fire to my barn to frighten us, this woman ran into the flames. A gasp went through the room. She did not run to save gold, Nayati said, his voice rising with suppressed emotion. She ran to save the only picture my daughters have of their mother. She burned her flesh to save a memory that is not even hers, because she knew it mattered to my children. He pointed to his own chest. If you want to drag her name through the mud to make yourselves feel clean, you go ahead, but you will have to look at your own hands first, and you will find them stained with soot and lies. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a town shamed. Jedediah Rourke saw the tide turning. He saw the judge's expression soften. He saw the investor's money slipping away. He signaled with a subtle nod to the back of the room. A man in a dusty duster coat, a hired gun known for his lack of scruples, stepped away from the wall. He did not aim for the ceiling. He drew his revolver and leveled it at Nayati. He's got a gun! Asha screamed from where she sat on the bench. The room erupted into chaos. Misses. Harlow stumbled and fell. The hired gun cocked the hammer. Court adjourned. Engine. Nayati moved. He did not move like a man of the town. He moved with the explosive, coiled speed of a warrior who had survived the Apache Wars. In one fluid motion, he kicked the heavy oak table, upending it. The heavy wood crashed onto its side, forming a barricade in front of Cora and the girls. Bang, the bullet buried itself in the tabletop, inches from where Cora's head had been. Nayati did not hide. As the table was falling, he had already drawn the Colt revolver at his hip, the weapon he had not touched in years but had never forgotten how to use. He did not fire to kill. He fired to end it. 2 shots rang out. So close together they sounded like one. The hired gun screamed, dropping his weapon as a bloom of red exploded on his right shoulder. He spun around and fell to his knees, clutching his arm. Sheriff Rourke fumbled for his own gun, but before he could clear leather, the click of a rifle hammer sounded behind him. I would not do that. Sheriff? Standing at the back of the room was a Comanche rider, one of Nayati's kinsmen, who had been watching from the shadows. His Winchester was leveled at the sheriff's head. The room froze. The smoke from the black powder hung in the air, stinging the nostrils. Nayati stood over the hired gun, his weapon steady, his chest heaving. He had not shot the sheriff. He had not shot the reverend. He had protected his family and disarmed the threat. The townspeople looked at the savage they had been told to fear. They saw a man who had just saved the room from a bloodbath. a man who had protected the white woman with his own body before returning fire. "Order," Judge Ruiz bellowed, slamming his gavel down so hard the handle cracked. "Order in this court." Sheriff Rourke slowly raised his hands away from his gun belt. "Arrest that man," Judge Ruiz pointed at the bleeding gunman. "And get the doctor, now." The judge turned his gaze to the prosecution table. Elijah Graves stood frozen, his face a mask of shock. His plan, the legal maneuvering, the fire, the hired intimidation had crumbled in seconds. "I have heard enough," Judge Ruiz said, his voice cold and final. "There is zero evidence of moral turpitude on the part of Mrs. Bennett. In fact, the only violence and immorality I have seen today has come from those who seek to accuse her." He looked at Nayati. "And as for the custody of Asha and Lena Cross, a man who defends his home with such restraint, and a woman who walks into fire for children not her own, I can think of no safer place for them. Case dismissed." The gavel strike sounded like a gunshot. "No!" Elijah screamed. The veneer of the holy man cracked and shattered. He lunged forward, his face twisted into an ugly snarl. "She is mine. She is a temptation incarnate. I saw her first. I broke her spirit for the Lord. You cannot give her to him." He pointed a shaking finger at Cora, saliva flying from his lips. "I smelled her fear in the vestry. I know the shape of her sin. She belongs on her knees, begging me for forgiveness, not playing house with a red-skinned animal." The courtroom went deadly silent. The obsession, the perversion, the sheer unadulterated madness of the Reverend was laid bare for every man and woman to see. That is not the voice of God. "Reverend, Mrs." Harlow said loudly into the silence. Elijah looked around, realizing too late what he had done. He had undressed his own soul. He staggered back, clutching his Bible like a shield, but it offered no protection against the truth. An hour later, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the throbbing ache of burns and bruises. They sat in the small back room of the town hall, waiting for the crowd to disperse. The doctor had dressed Cora's arm properly this time, with cooling salves and clean linen. Nayati stood by the window, watching the street. The sheriff was gone. Elijah was nowhere to be seen. The danger had passed, leaving them battered but standing. Cora sat on a wooden chair, her head leaning back against the wall. She felt lightheaded, drained of everything but a quiet, humming relief. Nayati turned from the window. He walked over to her, pulling a chair close so he could sit facing her. His knees brushed hers. He reached out and gently, so gently, touched the uninjured side of her face. "You should not have run into the fire," he said softly. "You should not have faced a gunman alone." Cora replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Nayati looked at her. The barriers were gone. The arrangement they had made in the rain shelter for help had been burned away, leaving something new and raw in its place. "When I stood in the court," Nayati said, his voice rough, "and I told them I needed a mother for the girls, I lied." Cora's heart skipped a beat. "You did, yes." Nayati leaned closer. His dark eyes searched hers, finding the reflection of his own soul. "I needed a mother for them, but I also needed a home for my heart. It has been wandering in the cold for a very long time." Cora let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She reached out with her good hand, tangling her fingers in the leather lapel of his coat. "I am not going anywhere." "Nayati," she whispered. "My wandering is done." He leaned in. It was not the frantic, hungry kiss of a romance novel. It was slow. It was the meeting of two people who had survived the storm and found the shore. His lips were warm and firm against hers. He tasted of dust and peppermint and life. Cora closed her eyes, melting into him. The pain in her arm faded into the background. For the first time since she had left Boston, since she had been branded an outcast, she felt whole. She was not a runaway bride. She was not a sinner. She was Cora Cross, and she was home. The return to the valley was not a triumphant march, but a quiet procession of survivors. The wagon creaked rhythmically over the uneven ground. the sound seeming loud in the stillness that followed the storm of the trial. When they crested the final rise and looked down at their home, the scar of the previous night was stark against the green earth. The barn was gone. In its place stood a skeleton of blackened timber and a pile of ash that still smoked lazily into the cold afternoon air. But the cabin stood. The corral, though damaged, held the livestock Nayati had managed to round up, and the creek still ran clear and cold, indifferent to the fires of men. Nayati stopped the wagon near the porch. He climbed down slowly, his movement stiff from the tension of the courtroom and the physical toll of the fire. He walked around to the other side and reached up for Cora. She slid into his arms, favoring her left side. Her arm throbbed beneath the clean bandages the doctor had applied, a dull, heavy ache that reminded her with every heartbeat of the price she had paid. "We are home," Nayati said quietly, setting her feet on the earth. The door of the cabin burst open. Asha and Lena had been left in the care of a neighbor, the blacksmith's wife, who had brought them back ahead of the wagon. They flew off the porch, their small legs churning. Papa Coralina reached them first, burying her face in Nayati's leg. Asha was slower, her eyes locked on Cora's bandaged arm. She stopped a foot away, her hands twisting in her apron. "Does it hurt?" Asha asked, her voice small. Cora knelt down, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her burned skin. She reached out with her good hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from Asha's forehead. "It hurts a little," Cora admitted, refusing to lie to the child. "But it will heal. We saved the important things. Asha, we saved the memories." Asha stepped forward and wrapped her arms gently around Cora's waist, careful not to touch the left side. It was a fragile embrace, lighter than a breath, but to Cora, it felt weightier than gold. The next 2 days were a blur of cleanup and restoration. The air in the valley was crisp, signaling the deepening of winter. Nayati worked from dawn until dusk, clearing the charred debris of the barn, his face set in a grim line of determination. Cora, limited by her injury, turned her attention to the interior of the cabin. She needed to organize, to nest, to reclaim the space from the chaos of the last week. She decided to finally sort through the heavy oak wardrobe that stood in the corner, the one piece of furniture that Nayati had never truly touched since Mary died. It was while she was folding a stack of woolen blankets that she felt it. The back panel of the wardrobe was loose. When she pushed a blanket against it, the wood gave way with a soft click. Cora paused. She looked toward the door, where the sound of Nayati's axe rang out against the scorched timber. She felt a flicker of hesitation. This was private, but the wood was already shifted, revealing a dark, hollow space behind the false back. Curiosity, and a strange sense of destiny, guided her hand. She reached into the dusty recess. Her fingers brushed against cool leather. She pulled out a small, flat pouch made of soft deerskin. It was old, the leather worn smooth by handling. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry. There was only a single envelope, sealed with red wax that had long since cracked. On the front, in a delicate, wavering hand, was written, "Who, Nayati. If you ever wonder why I couldn't stay?" Cora sat back on her heels, the breath leaving her lungs. It was a voice from the grave. She sat there for a long time, the envelope heavy in her lap. She knew she should not open it. It was not addressed to her. But she also knew that Nayati had lived for 2 years with a ghost, haunted by questions that had no answers. She tucked the pouch into her apron pocket and waited for the night. The evening meal was quiet. The girls, exhausted from playing near the creek, fell asleep early. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Nayati sat at the table, oiling his rifle. His hands were clean now, but the scars of his life were visible in the firelight. He looked up as Cora approached the table. "You look tired," he said gently. "Your arm." "It is fine," Cora said. She sat down opposite him. She placed the leather pouch on the table between them. Nayati froze. He recognized the pouch. He reached out slowly, his fingers hovering over the leather before touching it. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice rough. "In the wardrobe," Cora said softly. behind a loose board. I think she meant for you to find it eventually." Nayati opened the pouch. He pulled out the letter. His hands, usually so steady with a weapon or a horse, were trembling. He stared at the handwriting, his throat working as he swallowed back emotion. "Read it," Cora whispered. "You need to know." Nayati broke the seal. He unfolded the paper. Yellowed with age, he began to read, his lips moving silently at first, then stopping as if the words were physical blows. Mary's voice, silent for 2 years, filled the room through the ink. "My dearest Nayati, if you are reading this, then the darkness has finally taken me. I do not mean the fever. My love, I mean the shadow that lives in my mind. I see you watching me. I see the pain in your eyes when I cannot smile at our daughters. You think it is the valley. You think it is the hard winters, or the way the townspeople turn their heads when we pass. You blame yourself. You think you are not enough to make me happy. Oh, my love, you must never think that. You were my son. This valley was my heaven, but there is a sickness in me that has no name. It came after Lena was born. It is a gray veil that covers everything. I look at our beautiful babies and I feel nothing. And then I feel guilt so heavy it crushes my chest. I am torn between the world I was born into and the world we built, and I have lost the strength to bridge them. I am so tired. Nayati, I am scared that one day I will simply stop fighting. If I do, please know this: I did not leave because I regretted loving you. I loved you more than my own life. I left because I was broken long before I met you. Forgive me. Mary. Nayati let the paper fall to the table. He put his head in his hands. His shoulders began to shake. A silent, racking grief that he had held at bay since the day he buried her. She did not hate the life I gave her, he choked out, his voice thick with tears. I thought she withered here. I thought I killed her spirit by bringing her to the wild. No, Cora said, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. She was sick, Nayati. It was a sickness of the mind. It happens to women sometimes. It is a darkness that descends, and it is not your fault. It was never your fault. Nayati looked up. His eyes were red, swimming with tears, but for the first time, the haunted look, the deep, corroding guilt was gone. She loved me, he whispered. She loved us. She did, Cora confirmed, and she wanted you to know that so you could live again. Nayati turned his hand over, gripping Cora's fingers tightly. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting the tears fall freely. He laughed, a short, bitter, yet relieved sound. I have carried a mountain on my back for 2 years, he said, and a piece of paper has crumbled to dust. You are not the only one who felt unworthy, Cora said softly. We both thought we were not enough for the world, but the letter says otherwise. You were her son, Nayati. An hour later, under the light of a 3/4 moon, they walked out to the creek. The air was freezing, the frost glittering on the dry grass like diamond dust. They went to the spot where Cora had planted her small garden in the autumn, a patch of land where she had coaxed corn and beans to grow against the odds. Nayati knelt down. He used his knife to dig a small, deep hole in the semi-frozen earth. He held the letter for a moment, looking at the writing one last time. Then, he kissed the paper and placed it gently into the hole. He added a sprig of dried sage from his pocket and a single white river stone. Rest now, Mary, he whispered to the earth. Your girls are safe, and I am healing. He began to push the dirt back into the hole. Cora knelt beside him. She placed her bandaged hand on the mound of fresh earth. Nayati placed his large, warm hand over hers. The past is buried, Cora said. It is part of the soil now. It will feed the roots of what comes next. Nayati looked at her. The moonlight washed out the color of the world, turning everything into silver and shadow. But his eyes were bright and alive. Yes, he said. The past is soil. But you are the seed. He stood up and pulled her to her feet. The wind blew through the valley, but it no longer felt like a mournful cry. It felt like a song. They returned to the cabin. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a deep, red warmth over the room. Nayati locked the door not against wolves or sheriffs, but to shut the world out so they could exist only for each other. He turned to Cora. He did not speak. He walked to her and began to unbutton the heavy woolen coat she wore. His fingers were steady and deliberate. Cora did not pull away. She stood still, watching his face. The arrangement they had made, the pragmatic deal of shelter for labor, felt like a lifetime ago. "You are still hurt," Nayati murmured as he slid the coat from her shoulders. He looked at her bandaged arm with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "I am healing," Cora whispered. "I am strong enough." He cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones. "I do not want a housekeeper." "Cora," he said, his voice dropping to a husky rumble. "And I do not want a guest." "What do you want?" she asked, her breath catching. "I want the woman who ran into the fire for me," he said. "I want the woman who stood up to the Reverend. I want you." He lowered his head and kissed her. This kiss was different from the one in the town hall. That had been a seal of partnership. This was a declaration of hunger. It was deep and slow, igniting a heat that started in her belly and spread to her fingertips. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her not to the pallet on the floor, but to the bed in the corner, the bed that had been solitary for so long. He laid her down on the quilt. He undressed her slowly, reverently, treating her body not as a temptation or a sin, but as a revelation. When his skin touched hers, it was electric. The contrast of his rough hands against her soft skin, the heat of his chest against her breasts, stripped away the last of her defenses. "I love you," Cora whispered into the darkness. It was the first time she had said the words aloud to anyone. "I love you, Nayati." "I have loved you since the rain brought you," he confessed against her neck. They moved together in the firelight, their shadows merging on the wall. There was no shame in this union, no ghost of Elijah's sermons. There was only the sound of their breathing, the crackle of the wood, and the profound, healing knowledge that two broken halves had finally found their way to become whole. They belonged to no one but each other. The peace of the valley was broken 3 days later, not by lawmen, but by industry. Jedediah Rourke, having lost the legal battle, decided that brute force was the only language left. It began with the rumble of wagons, a crew of railroad workers, armed with shovels, pickaxes, and sledgehammers, marched down the trail leading into the valley. They were led by a foreman with a thick neck and a penchant for violence, acting on Jedediah's orders to start the survey, regardless of the Indian. Nayati saw them coming. He did not panic. He walked out to the porch, his Winchester in his hand, but he did not stand alone. From the trail behind the cabin, horses emerged. It was Herr Schmidt, the blacksmith, carrying a heavy iron hammer. Beside him rode 2 of the Mexican vaqueros who worked the southern range. And flanking Nayati were 3 Comanche warriors, his cousins who had heard the story of the courtroom. They formed a line across the valley floor, a living wall of defiance. The railroad crew stopped. They were hired to dig holes and lay track, not to fight a war against a coalition of the valley's outcasts. Jedediah Rourke rode to the front on a nervous gelding. He looked at Nayati, then at the blacksmith, then at the silent Comanche warriors. He saw the glint of steel and the resolve in their eyes. "This is obstruction of commerce," Jedediah shouted, though his voice lacked its usual bluster. "We have a right-of-way." "You have a map," Nayati called back calmly. "Maps can be changed." "You think you can stop the railroad?" Jedediah sneered. "I think the pass to the north is only 2 miles longer," Nayati said, "and the rock there is softer. It will cost you less money to move the line than it will cost you in blood to cross this land." Jedediah looked at his crew. The men were leaning on their shovels, looking uneasy. They were not paid enough to die for a surveyor's shortcut. Before Jedediah could give a foolish order, another rider appeared. It was Judge Ruiz. The judge rode between the 2 groups. He looked at Jedediah with cold eyes. "Mr. Rourke," the judge said, "I suggest you listen to Mr. Cross, I have reviewed the territorial surveys. The northern pass is indeed viable, and if you persist in trespassing on private land after my court has ruled on the character of this family, I will personally issue an injunction that will freeze your assets for 6 months. Jedediah turned a shade of purple that matched the bruise on his ego. He looked at the line of defenders, white, brown, and red men standing shoulder to shoulder. He realized he had lost. The valley was no longer just a piece of dirt owned by a savage. It was a community. Fine, Jedediah spat. He yanked his horse's reins around. Pack it up, we move north. As the dust of the retreating work crew settled, Nayati lowered his rifle. He looked at Herr Schmidt and nodded. The blacksmith raised his hammer in a silent salute. The final loose thread was cut the following Sunday. Reverend Elijah Graves was leaving Mesquite Crossing. The scandal of his outburst in court had shattered his congregation. The women who had once hung on his every word now crossed the street to avoid him. His funding from the Eastern Diocese had been suspended pending an investigation into his conduct. His carriage was loaded. He stood by the step, his black coat dusty, his face gaunt and bitter. Cora and Nayati had come into town for supplies, a deliberate act of normalcy. They walked down the boardwalk, Cora's arm still in a sling, but her head held high. They stopped near the carriage. Elijah looked at Cora. The hunger was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, vacuous hate. "You think you have won?" Elijah hissed, his voice raspy. "But you are still damned. Cora, you have made your bed in filth. God will judge you when you stand before the throne. He will ask you why you chose the flesh over the spirit." The old Cora, the terrified girl in the Boston vestry, would have trembled, but the woman who stood there now had walked through fire. Cora stepped forward. She looked Elijah in the eye, her gaze steady and clear. "If God exists, Elijah," she said, her voice calm. "He was there when I pulled the memories from the fire. He was there when I held 2 motherless children while they wept. He was there when this man gave me shelter, when you gave me stones." She reached out and took Nayati's hand, lacing her fingers with his in plain sight of the town. "I do not fear his judgment," Cora said, "because I know that love is not a sin, and family is not a crime. If God is love, then I am closer to him in that valley than I ever was in your church." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I am not afraid of him," she whispered, "and I am certainly not afraid of you anymore." Elijah opened his mouth to speak, to summon one last curse, but no words came. He looked at the couple standing in the sunlight, the warrior and the outcast bride, and he saw a strength he could not break. He climbed into his carriage without a word. The driver snapped the reins, and the vehicle lurched forward, carrying the Reverend out of Mesquite Crossing and out of their lives forever. Cora watched him go until the carriage was just a speck in the dust. Then she turned to Nayati. "Let's go home," she said. "Yes," Nayati replied, lifting her onto the wagon seat. "Let's go home." They rode out of town, leaving the whispers behind, turning their faces toward the valley where the fire had burned away the past, leaving the ground fertile for the future. The winter snows had melted, feeding the creek until it sang a boisterous song against the rocks. The blackened scar where the barn had stood was now softened by the green shoots of new grass, and fresh timber was already stacked, waiting for Nayati's hands to shape it into something stronger than what had stood before. But on this particular afternoon, the axes were silent. The hammers rested in the shed. The valley was not a place of labor, but a cathedral of golden light. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the sandstone cliffs in hues of amber and deep violet. There were no pews, no organ music, and no stained glass. Instead, garlands of wildflowers, bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, and desert marigolds were strung between the 2 largest cottonwood trees near the water. Interwoven with the blooms were eagle feathers, gifts from Nayati's kinsmen, and strips of white lace salvaged from an old dress found in the trunk, a silent nod to Mary, whose blessing they felt in the gentle breeze. Guests had gathered. It was a small congregation, but one forged in fire. Mrs. Harlow stood in her best Sunday silk, holding a handkerchief to her eyes. Herr Schmidt, The blacksmith stood beside her, looking uncomfortable but solemn in a suit that strained at his massive shoulders. Judge Ruiz was there, holding a leather-bound book, representing the law that had finally bent toward justice rather than prejudice. And standing before them, waiting, was Nayati. He wore a tunic of soft, bleached deerskin, embroidered with beads in the colors of the earth and sky. His hair was unbraided, flowing loose and dark over his shoulders. He did not look like the terrifying warrior the town whispered about, nor did he look like the broken widower who had once hidden in this valley. He looked like a king in his own domain. Then, the door of the cabin opened. Cora stepped out. She did not wear a gown of silk or satin ordered from the east. She wore a dress of simple cream cotton, sewn by her own hands in the long winter evenings. But around her waist was a sash of intricately woven red and blue wool, a Comanche pattern. Her hair was pinned up, adorned not with diamonds, but with small white flowers. The burns on her arm had healed into silvery scars, which she did not hide. They were part of her history now, a map of the price she had paid to be here. Lena walked ahead of her, wobbling slightly in her excitement. The 4-year-old carried a basket larger than herself, scattering wildflowers with enthusiastic abandon, leaving a trail of color on the earth. Asha walked beside Cora. The 8-year-old girl wore a dress that matched Cora's, her face scrubbed clean, her dark eyes solemn. She did not look at the guests. She looked only at her father, and then at the woman walking beside her. In her hands, she carried a length of soft, braided leather. When Cora reached the spot between the cottonwood trees, Nayati stepped forward. He did not wait for the ceremony to bring them together. His eyes had already crossed the distance. Judge Ruiz cleared his throat, opening his book. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice competing gently with the sound of the creek, not just to join a man and a woman, but to witness the knitting together of two worlds. He looked at Nayati and Cora. "You have chosen to stand together against the storm." The judge said, "You have chosen to build a shelter not made of wood and stone, but of loyalty. Do you bring your vows?" Nayati took Cora's hands. His thumbs brushed over her knuckles, rough against smooth. "I do not offer you a life of ease." "Cora," Nayati said. His voice was deep, carrying the resonance of the earth itself. "The wind will still blow, the snow will still fall, and there are those who will still look at us with narrow eyes." He paused, looking deep into her blue eyes. "But I promise you this. I will be the shield between you and the wind. I will be the wall between you and the lies they tell. When the darkness comes, as it comes to all men, I will not shut you out. I will listen to your voice before I listen to my own fear." He squeezed her hands. "I do not ask you to walk behind me. I ask you to walk beside me, from this sunrise to the last sunset." Cora felt tears prick her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She wanted to see him clearly. "I do not offer you a silent wife, Nayati," she replied, her voice steady and clear, reaching the ears of every person there. "I have found my voice in this valley, and I will use it to defend this house. I promise that I will not run when the hard days come. I promise that your daughters will never again wonder if they are alone." She looked at his scars, then at her own. "I promise that I am yours, not because I have no other place to go, but because there is no other place I wish to be." Judge Ruiz nodded, a smile touching his weathered face. "Then let the binding be done." Asha stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the braided leather cord. Nayati and Cora clasped their right hands together, wrist to wrist, with great care. Asha wound the leather around their joined wrists. She tied the knot firmly, pulling it tight. It was a Comanche tradition, symbolizing a bond that could not be broken by force, only by choice. "With this cord," Asha whispered, reciting the words her father had taught her, "You are one breath, one fire, one heart, and by the power vested in me by the territory," Judge Ruiz announced, "and by the laws of the earth and sky, I pronounce you husband and wife." Nayati did not wait. He leaned down, and Cora rose to meet him. The kiss was not the desperate collision of their first night, nor the tentative exploration of the early days. It was a seal, It was an affirmation. It was a promise kept. Then, Nayati reached for a heavy blanket draped over a low branch, a beautiful robe patterned with geometric stars. He swung it around himself and Cora, enveloping them both in a single cocoon, shutting out the world for a brief, private moment of shared warmth. From the gathered guests, a cheer went up. Herr Schmidt clapped his massive hands, and Mrs. Harlow dabbed her eyes openly. Lena squealed, running to hug her father's legs through the blanket. The celebration lasted until the stars began to prick the indigo canvas of the sky. There was roasted venison, corn cakes dripping with honey, and music provided by a fiddle player Herr Schmidt had brought from the settlement. As the fire died down and the guests began to make their way back to town or to their bedrolls, a quiet settled over the valley. Cora stood near the edge of the porch, watching the moon rise over the ridge. The air was cooling, but she felt a warmth that radiated from within. She felt a tug on her skirt. She looked down. It was Asha. The girl should have been asleep hours ago, but her eyes were wide and alert in the moonlight. "Asha," Cora said softly, crouching down so they were eye to level. "Why are you not in bed?" Asha looked at Cora's hands, then at her face. The joy of the wedding had faded from the child's expression, replaced by a lingering shadow of the courtroom. "Cora?" Asha asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sweetling. The paper the judge signed," Asha said, scuffing her toe in the dirt. "Does it mean the bad men can't come back? Does it mean they can never take us?" Cora's heart broke a little. She realized that for this child, happiness was always fragile, always waiting to be snatched away by a man in a black coat or a sheriff with a gun. Cora went down on both knees in the dirt, ignoring the stain on her wedding dress. She took Asha's small hands in hers. "Look at me, Asha," she commanded gently. The girl met her gaze. "The paper is strong," Cora said. "But do you know what is stronger?" Asha shook her head. "Me," Cora said fiercely. "And your father. And you." She brought Asha's hands to her lips and kissed them. "As long as there is breath in my body, I will fight for you. If they come with papers, I will fight them with words. If they come with guns, I will fight them with everything I have. There is no judge, no sheriff, and no king who can take you from my arms. Do you understand?" Asha searched Cora's face. She saw the truth there. She saw the same fierce light that had sent Cora running into a burning barn. The tension left the girl's small shoulders. She took a shuddering breath and stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Cora's neck, burying her face in the curve of Cora's shoulder. "I believe you," Asha whispered. Then, after a long heartbeat, she added a single word that sealed the covenant of the day more than any judge could. "Mother." Cora closed her eyes, holding the child tight, tears finally spilling over to track through the dust on her cheeks. She rocked her back and forth under the vast, silent sky. She had been an outcast. She had been a runaway. But now, she is a mother. And she knew, with a certainty that anchored her soul, that she would never run again. Many decades later, the sun was hot, beating down on the tin roof of the old cabin. But inside, the air remained cool and smelled of cedar and history. The cabin had changed over the years. An extra room had been added to the back, and the floor was now polished wood rather than packed earth. But the heart of the place, the great stone hearth and the heavy timber beams remained exactly as they had been in the year 1875. A young woman sat in a rocking chair near the window. Her name was Sarah, and she had the high cheekbones of her grandfather and the stubborn chin of the woman whose diary rested in her lap. Sarah ran her hand over the cracked leather cover of the journal. It was old, the pages yellow and brittle, smelling of dried lavender and thyme. Outside, the world had moved on. The 20th century had arrived with its automobiles and its noise, far in the distance, miles to the north. The steam whistle of a locomotive sounded a lonely cry that faded quickly in the vastness of the landscape. The railroad had never crossed this valley. The survey lines had been drawn, The dynamite had been ready, but the land and the people on it had held firm. Sarah opened the diary to the very last entry, dated 40 years prior. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was strong and looping. The hand of a woman who knew her own mind. November 14th, 1902. Nayati passed this morning. He went quietly, sitting in his chair by the creek, watching the sun come up over the ridge. He did not suffer. He simply closed his eyes and stepped into the clearing where I know Mary is waiting to thank him. I am an old woman now. My hands are gnarled like the roots of the cottonwoods. I cannot walk as far as I once did, but as I sit here, waiting to join him, I look back at the winding path that brought me to this valley. They called me the runaway bride. They called me the outcast. They thought I was lost, but they were wrong. I was never lost. I was merely traveling toward the only place I could be found. I want my granddaughters to know this. Do not let the world tell you who you are. Do not let them print your value on a wanted poster or a church bulletin. You are worth what you are willing to fight for. I loved a man the world called a savage, and I found in his hands a gentleness that the civilized men of the East could not comprehend. We built a life out of wind and stone and love. It was not easy. It was never easy. But it was ours. If you are reading this, know that love does not always arrive with flowers and poetry. Sometimes it arrives in the rain, on a horse, offering you shelter when you have none. And sometimes the greatest act of love is simply refusing to move when the storm tries to blow you away. Sarah closed the book gently. She wiped a tear from her cheek, smiling. She stood up and walked out onto the porch. The wooden planks creaked familiarly under her boots. She looked down toward the creek. The cottonwood tree where they had buried the letter from the first wife was enormous now, its branches spreading wide like protective arms over the water. A tire swing hung from one of the boughs, swaying gently in the breeze, down by the water. 2 children were playing Sarah's own son and daughter. They were splashing in the shallows, their laughter rising up like bubbles to burst in the clear air. They were the great-grandchildren of a Comanche warrior and a Boston lady, living proof that love could bridge any divide. Sarah looked out at the horizon. The railroad was a thin line of smoke in the distance, a symbol of a changing world that marched on relentlessly. But here, in the valley, the time felt suspended. The spirit of the place remained. It was in the rustle of the corn stalks in the garden. It was in the sturdy lines of the corral fence. It was in the wind that swept down from the canyon, whispering stories to anyone who stayed still enough to listen. Sarah leaned against the porch post, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. "Thank you, Grandma Cora," she whispered to the wind. "Thank you for staying." The sun dipped below the horizon, setting the sky ablaze one last time before yielding to the velvet night. There are no marble statues in Mesquite Crossing bearing the names of Nayati and Cora Cross. The town history books mention them only in passing, as a footnote in the land disputes of the 1870s. But statues crumble, and ink fades. The true monument is the valley itself. It is in the laughter of the children who still run barefoot through the creek. It is in the fire that is lit every evening in the stone hearth, a flame that has not been allowed to go out for 3 generations. In the wind that scours the high desert, in the red earth that holds the roots of the sagebrush, and in the relentless, enduring flow of the water. Their story remains. It is a story of a widower who needed a mother for his girls, and an outcast bride who needed shelter, and how, in the space between those needs, they found a love that conquered the world. They are free, they are enduring, and in the heart of the wild, they are alive. Thank you so much for journeying with me through the dust, the rain, and the fire of Cora and Nayati's story. It has been a pleasure to bring the Wild West of 1875 to life for you. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below, letting me know where in the world you are listening from, and what you thought of the ending. Did the letters from the past touch your heart as much as they did mine? If you enjoyed this tale of love and survival, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Don't forget to hit the like button and smash that hype button to help this story ride the algorithm and reach more listeners. Your support keeps the campfire burning and the stories coming. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.